A 15-year-old beggar girl finds a very expensive handbag in the middle of the street. When she opened it, she expected money, but she found a photo of herself as a baby. Days later, she was greeted by a rich woman who trembled at the sight of her. "You're alive," she said, crying. But when she saw the girl's necklace, everything changed. Don't miss a second of this story that will surprise you with its ending, and join us on this journey. Now tell me in the comments where you're watching this story from. Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The Chicago sky was the color of wet concrete that winter morning, and Zadie had already lost count of how many nights she'd slept, curled up beneath the shadows of the overpass near Jackson Boulevard. Her fingers, reddened by the cold, clutched the frayed edge of a coat too thin for the season. The temperature continued to drop, and snowflakes began to dance in the frigid air, settling on her dark, curly hair. Earlier, city workers had rousted her and other homeless individuals from their makeshift shelters under the bridge, pushing them out to make way for a clean-up operation ahead of a downtown tourism event. "You need to move along," the man in the orange vest had said, his voice monotonous as if repeating the same words every day. "Mayor's orders." Zadie watched as workers collected the few belongings people couldn't grab in time. A blanket here, a worn backpack there, tossing everything into large black bags. She had experienced this so many times that she'd developed a system. She slept with her backpack as a pillow, kept her fake ID and half-moon pendant always around her neck, beneath her clothes. It was all that remained from a past she could barely remember. Her stomach burned with hunger. Almost 2 days had passed since her last real meal, which consisted of leftovers from a diner where one of the cooks sometimes left food for the homeless. Zadie had learned to ignore the empty feeling in her stomach, but on this particular day, hunger screamed, demanding attention. The 15-year-old girl walked along the avenue, her worn-out boots with soles taped together, barely protecting her feet from the cold asphalt. Her olive skin was marked with dirt and small cuts. Her dark, curly hair fell in tangled waves down her back. But her emerald green eyes, penetrating, unwavering, impossible to ignore, suggested a fierce mind and dormant beauty behind the hardship. She didn't use her real name on the streets. Zadie was hers, but in a world where information could be weaponized, names were guarded like treasures. Having a real name meant having a past, and pasts could be traced. She didn't want to be found, not after everything that had happened. When she passed the Briar and Bloom Cafe, an upscale establishment filled with professionals typing on laptops and drinking elaborate coffees with floral designs, she tried to shelter in the entrance to escape the cutting wind. "Get lost, street trash. You're scaring away customers," said a security guard, approaching with firm steps. Zadie swallowed the lump in her throat and kept walking. She was accustomed to contempt, to glances that passed through her as if she were invisible. 3 years on the streets had taught her that people like her, young people without names, without homes, without recognizable pasts, were urban ghosts. They existed in the shadows, invisible until they became inconvenient. The icy wind cut her face when across the street something caught her attention. On the curb, partially covered by the snow that was beginning to accumulate, was a handbag. Not just any bag, but one made of genuine leather, far too elegant to be simply abandoned on that sidewalk. Zadie looked around, expecting to see someone desperately searching for their lost item. The street continued its normal rhythm, executives walking hurriedly, tourists consulting digital maps, teenagers in noisy groups. No one seemed to have noticed the bag. She hesitated for a moment. Stealing wasn't her style. She preferred to ask for help or take odd jobs when she could, but hunger had a voice, and today it screamed. With a quick movement, she crossed the street, grabbed the bag, and vanished into a nearby alley like smoke. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she hid between 2 large trash containers, sheltered from curious eyes. With trembling fingers, she opened the clasp. Inside, credit cards, a sleek smartphone, a leather wallet with enough cash to eat for a month. But tucked beside the ID was something that made her freeze, a photo of a little girl. Her. Clean clothes, neatly brushed hair, 5 years old, smiling on a swing set. Her hands trembled as she held the photograph. What? What is this? Scents and sounds flooded her memory. Cinnamon in a warm kitchen, a lullaby in a language she couldn't quite remember, a man's deep laugh tossing her into the air. Then the cold echo of state institutions and group homes. She slid down the alley wall, breathing hard. Her mind reeled with fragments. 7 foster homes, the 3rd where she was hit. Discipline is love, the woman had said as she burned her with cigarettes. The 5th where she was a maid, waking at 5 a.m. to scrub toilets. The last from which she fled at 12 after her foster father began staring, touching. Why is this in her bag? She whispered, looking at the photo again. She examined the contents and found a business card. Aisling Donnelly Foundation for Youth. There was also a high-level access badge for Monarch Tower, one of the most secure corporate buildings in the River North Business District, and a flyer for Haven Shelter, the one where she sometimes slept, with a handwritten note and an anonymous donation circled in blue. Zadie should have run, taken the money, vanished. But something was now louder than hunger, curiosity, and a feeling she hated more than anything: hope. As the sky darkened and the snow fell more heavily, Zadie remained motionless in that alley, holding a photograph that shouldn't exist, an image of herself from a time she couldn't remember. In the solitude of that moment, a dangerous thought took shape in her mind. What if there was more to her past than institutions and foster homes? What if someone had been looking for her all this time? The half-moon pendant around her neck seemed heavier now, as if it had suddenly gained meaning. When her fingers touched the cold metal, something strange happened. For the first time in years, Zadie felt hot tears running down her dirty cheeks. The bathroom at the youth shelter on Michigan Avenue had cracked mirrors and lights that flickered intermittently, but for Zadie, that morning it was a palace. She had used part of the money found in the bag to buy second-hand clothes, a decent coat, jeans that actually fit, a clean blouse, and boots without holes. $5 guaranteed a hot shower, the first in weeks. The warm water ran down her body, washing away layers of city grime, revealing the olive skin she had almost forgotten she had. As she washed, her fingers instinctively touched the small half-moon pendant hanging around her neck. It was the only thing she had from before the system. She didn't know where it came from. It was simply hers. 15 minutes, honey. There are more people waiting, said a shelter worker, knocking softly on the door. I'm almost done, Zadie replied, reluctantly turning off the faucet. Dry and dressed in clean clothes, Zadie faced her reflection in the stained mirror. For a moment, she didn't recognize the person staring back. Her dark, curly hair, now clean, framed a face that looked younger, less hardened. The green eyes, her most distinctive feature, seemed brighter without the shadows of exhaustion. Who are you? She whispered to her reflection, unable to reconcile the image before her with the girl in the photograph or with the street teenager she had become. From the pocket of her new coat, she took out the photograph found in the bag. The girl on the swing smiled without worries, the same green eyes sparkling with childish joy. She turned the photo over, looking for an inscription, date, anything that might provide more clues. On the back, she discovered something she hadn't noticed before, a small hand-drawn symbol, a crescent moon, almost identical to her pendant. Her heart raced. It couldn't be coincidence. Leaning on the sink, Zadie spread out the other items from the bag. Aisling Donnelly's business card, the Monarch Tower badge, the shelter flyer. She was about to do something dangerous, something against all the survival instincts she had developed on the streets. She was about to trust fate. "Good ladies, breakfast will be served in 10 minutes, announced a voice in the hallway. Zadie put everything away, except the badge and the business card. Instead of heading to the cafeteria, she made her way to the exit. Monarch Tower rose like a column of glass and steel against Chicago's gray sky. With its 70 floors and a design reminiscent of a crown at the top, the building was a monument to corporate power, imposing, intimidating, and extremely secure. Zadie stopped on the opposite sidewalk, observing the flow of executives and employees entering and exiting the glass revolving doors. All wore impeccable clothing, carried leather briefcases or tablets, and displayed the same determined look. People with purpose, with a place in the world. The opposite of her. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, adjusting her coat and straightening her shoulders. "Just imitate them." She crossed the street with measured steps, neither too fast to appear nervous nor too slow to attract attention. She pushed the revolving door and entered the marble atrium, so immense that her breath momentarily caught in her throat. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, and an artificial waterfall descended along an entire wall, the sound of water creating a soft music that echoed in the space. In the center of the atrium, a circular counter was staffed by immaculately looking receptionists. Zadie approached, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "Good morning," said the receptionist, her professional smile not reaching her eyes. "How may I help you?" "I believe I have a meeting," Zadie replied, her voice steady, mimicking the tone she had heard female executives use in the cafe. "Your name, and with whom would the meeting be?" Zadie felt a drop of cold sweat run down her spine. She hadn't thought that far ahead. Her eyes fell on the badge in her hand, seeing for the first time the full name printed. Aisling Donnelly Varela. "I have an appointment with Aisling Donnelly Varela," she said, trying not to show hesitation. "She lost something, I found." The receptionist typed something on her computer, her expression unchanged. "Ms. Donnelly Varela hasn't registered any meetings for this morning." "It was last minute," Zadie explained, feeling panic rising. "Maybe you could call her." The woman raised a perfectly outlined eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Oh, and your name is?" At that moment, the elevator doors to the right opened, and a group of executives emerged, chatting animatedly. Among them, a woman with intense red hair, pulled back in an elegant bun, wore an impeccable grey suit. Her green eyes, identical to Zadie's, were fixed on a folder she was holding. Time seemed to freeze. Even from a distance, Zadie felt something impossible to explain, a kind of instinctive recognition, as if her body knew something her mind had not yet processed. The red-headed woman was like looking into a future mirror 20 years ahead. Before the receptionist could call security, Zadie made an impulsive decision. She raised the access badge as if it were a legitimate credential and walked purposefully toward the elevators, swerving around the group that had just exited. A security guard observed her, but the badge in her hand and her confident posture seemed sufficient. "Aisling?" Zadie heard someone call, and the red-headed woman turned. Confirmation. It was her. Entering an empty elevator, Zadie swiped the badge on the reader. Green lights lit up and a soft voice announced, "Access authorized for the executive floor." As the elevator ascended, Zadie tried to control her breathing, which had become irregular and shallow. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider what she was really doing, confronting a possible past, a possible family, a possible identity. What if the photograph was just a coincidence? What if the red-headed woman had no relation to her? And worse, what if she did, but wanted nothing to do with a street teenager she had abandoned years ago? The elevator stopped on the 68th floor, and the doors slid silently open. Zadie stepped into a quiet corridor, decorated with abstract paintings and illuminated by indirect lighting, not a soul in sight. At the end of the corridor, a discreet sign indicated Ashir Varela, CEO, Varela Development Group. Zadie took one step forward, then another. The name on the sign triggered something in her memory. Fragments of a long-forgotten dream. A deep voice, words in a foreign language, the smell of spices. As she advanced down the corridor, Zadie heard voices coming from a conference room. Through the glass walls, she could see a meeting ending. Executives in dark suits shook hands and gathered documents. In the center of them, with his back to the corridor, stood a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, black hair with discreet grey strands at the temples. When he turned to the door, Zadie held her breath. His skin was darker than hers, but the features were unmistakable. The shape of the nose, the arch of the eyebrows, the structure of the face. He looked like her. "May I help you?" asked an assistant, noticing Zadie standing in the corridor, but Zadie was already in motion. Heart pounding hard against her ribs, she quickly passed the assistant and entered the conference room, the found handbag firmly gripped in her hands. The man, whom she could now see from the nameplate on the table, was Ashir Varela, turned in surprise at the interruption, his dark, penetrating eyes fixed on hers. For an instant that seemed eternal, neither spoke. The air in the room seemed charged with static electricity. With trembling hands, Zadie placed the bag on the table. "Why does your wife have a photo of me?" she asked, her voice breaking on the last word. The room fell into absolute silence. Ashir Varela remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the teenager before him as if seeing a ghost. The executive, normally unflappable in the tensest negotiations, seemed to have momentarily lost the ability to speak. His hand, still holding a brand-name pen, trembled slightly when he finally responded, "What did you say?" Zadie pushed the bag across the polished table. "This bag, I found it yesterday. It has a photo of me inside, from when I was little." The last executives still in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure how to react to this unexpected interruption. A man in a grey suit cleared his throat. "Ashir, should we postpone the rest of the discussion? It seems you have a personal matter to resolve." Varela, still visibly disturbed, regained part of his composure. "Yes, Wayne, we can continue tomorrow. Please, leave us alone." The executives left quickly, some casting curious glances at Zadie as they passed. The conference room door closed with a soft click, leaving the teenager alone with the CEO. Ashir opened the bag carefully, as if handling something potentially explosive. When his fingers found the photograph, his face changed, a mix of recognition and confusion. "Where did you find this?" "I already told you. I found the bag on the street," Zadie replied, crossing her arms defensively. "That photo, it's me, isn't it?" "When I was little." Ashir didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Zadie's face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "What's your name?" he finally asked. "Zadie," she replied automatically, then added, "At least that's what I've called myself for a few years." "Zadie," repeated Ashir, as if testing the sound of the word. "And then you don't have a last name?" The question had a strange, almost hopeful tone that Zadie couldn't interpret. "I don't use a last name. Not anymore." The silence between them was dense, loaded with unformulated questions. Ashir was about to say something when the door to the room opened again. The red-haired woman from the lobby, Aisling, entered, her gaze initially fixed on some documents in her hands. "Ashir, Wayne told me you cancelled the continuation of the meeting, but we need to define our strategy before the—" Her words died when she looked up and saw Zadie. The shock on her face was visceral. Documents slipped from her suddenly strengthless fingers, scattering across the polished wooden floor. Her face, already naturally pale, lost all color. "My God," she whispered. Zadie felt a shiver run down her spine. The woman's eyes, her eyes the same unusual green, were wide with shock, shining with unshed tears. "She says she found your purse," explained Ashir, his voice strangely controlled. "With a photograph inside." Aisling brought her hand to her mouth, taking an unsteady step forward. How did you find me?" "I wasn't looking for you," Zadie replied more coldly than she intended. "I found a bag, that's all." A tense silence filled the room as Aisling slowly approached, as if fearing Zadie might disappear if she made any sudden movements. She bent down, collecting the scattered documents with trembling hands, more out of a need to do something than out of real concern for the papers. "The bag," Aisling finally said, her voice trembling slightly. I lost it yesterday. I was looking for it. It has a photo of me inside. At least it looks like me, Zadie stated, getting straight to the point. Why? Aisling finally straightened up, holding the documents against her chest like a shield. Because, she began, her voice failing. Her eyes met Ashir's, full of something that seemed like pleading and guilt. Ashir frowned, confusion evident on his face. And Aisling, what's going on? Where does this photograph come from? Aisling took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders as if preparing to face something feared for a long time. The photo. Zadie. She's my daughter. The words fell into the room like stones in still water, creating invisible waves of shock. Ashir moved away from the table as if he had received a physical blow, his face a mask of disbelief. Zadie, who had expected something like this since the moment she saw the photograph, still felt the impact of the statement like a punch to the stomach. One thing was to suspect, another completely different was to hear the words. "Oh, your daughter?" she repeated, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Then why did I grow up in shelters? Why was I placed in 7 different homes? Why was I sleeping under an overpass last night?" Aisling paled even more, if that was possible. I didn't know. I didn't know what had happened to you." "You had a daughter," interrupted Ashir, his normally controlled voice now tense with contained emotion. "All these years, and you never mentioned you had a daughter." Zadie observed the exchange, feeling strangely displaced, as if watching a movie in which she supposedly had a leading role, but from which she was somehow being excluded. The familiar feeling of being invisible, even when she was the center of the situation, hit her with renewed force. "When you told me you couldn't have children," Ashir began, his voice overflowing with disbelief. "I never said I couldn't have children," corrected Aisling, her voice almost a whisper. "I said I didn't have children. It was technically true as far as I knew." "Technically true?" repeated Ashir, incredulous. "You abandoned a child and decided that made you, technically, not a mother." "I didn't abandon her." Aisling suddenly raised her voice, tears now flowing freely down her face. "I was 16. My grandfather, Hugh Finnegan, he forced me. Said he would ruin 2 families if I didn't give up the baby. The documents. He made me sign papers I didn't understand. He promised she would go to a good, stable family." Zadie felt something break inside her. The anger she had contained since seeing the photograph escaped like steam from a pressure cooker. "Good. Stable. You call 7 homes good. Being beaten, used, discarded?" Ashir watched, shaken to the core. "Why didn't you tell me?" Aisling stared at him. "Because I was ashamed. When we met in London, you were already this rising star. How do you tell someone like you that you left a child behind?" "You didn't leave me," Zadie interrupted. "You gave me away. There's a difference." The silence that followed was broken only by Aisling's contained sobs. Ashir moved away, walking to the window that showed the panorama of Chicago. His rigid posture revealed the emotional storm he was trying to control. It was then that something caught Aisling's attention. Her eyes fixed on Zadie's neck, where the half-moon pendant was partially visible. "That pendant," she whispered, approaching. "I left it with you." Zadie instinctively backed away, her hand flying to protect the only object she had always considered truly hers. "It's mine," she declared defensively. "Oh, it's always been mine?" "Yes," agreed Aisling, her voice soft. "It's yours. I put it on you before." Her voice failed. She took a deep breath and then, with trembling fingers, reached for her own neck, pulling out from inside her blouse a silver chain. At the end hung the other half of the crescent moon. Zadie's eyes widened. Her pendant wasn't just a half moon. It was literally half of a complete pendant, designed to fit with the other half that Aisling was now showing. "One for me, one for you," explained Aisling, tears now flowing freely. "So that one day, if we met again—" She didn't complete the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. The meaning was crystal clear. Zadie felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a connection, a tangible bond with a past that until now existed only in memory fragments and fleeting dreams. The pendant wasn't just an object, it was physical proof that at some point someone had cared enough to create a path back. Ashir finally turned from the window. His face, previously a mask of shock, now showed signs of something different, a nascent understanding perhaps. "You said you were 16, he said to Aisling, his voice calm, almost clinical. "Was that when you were in Dublin?" Aisling nodded silently. "And then the father, a Turkish exchange student," she replied, her eyes never leaving Ashir's. "We met in the summer. It was brief, but..." Ashir visibly paled. "I did an exchange in Dublin in the summer of 2009. Understanding hit Zadie like an icy wave. She looked from one to the other, seeing for the first time the similarities she had ignored, the shape of her nose and Ashir's, the same arch of the eyebrows, the similar structure of the face. "You," she began, looking at Ashir. "You're my father." Ashir seemed unable to answer, his gaze locked on Aisling's, silently demanding confirmation. "You never said your last name that summer," explained Aisling. "I knew you were Turkish, but little else. When we met again in London 5 years ago, I didn't make the connection immediately. You had a different name in business, Ashir Varela, instead of the Turkish name you used as a student. And then, when I finally realized who you were, you lied," concluded Ashir, his voice strangely calm. "All these years." "I didn't lie," Aisling defended herself. "I omitted. I was afraid of losing you, of you blaming me. And then, the more time passed, the harder it became to tell the truth," completed Ashir, an unprecedented bitterness in his voice. Zadie observed the exchange, feeling the familiar sensation of invisibility flooding her again. The two adults in front of her were too absorbed in their own drama to notice her growing discomfort. "She's standing right here," Zadie said suddenly, her voice cutting through their argument. "I'm not a secret to be revealed. I'm a person with a life that you two created, then abandoned." She took a step back. This was a mistake. Her movement toward the door seemed to snap both adults back to reality. "Wait," Aisling pleaded. "Hey, please don't go." Ashir stepped forward as well, his professional demeanor completely broken. Please just give us a moment to process this." "Process what?" Zadie asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "That the daughter you never wanted showed up? That your perfect lives might get complicated? That's not fair," Aisling said, tears streaming down her face. "I looked for you, for years. I tried to find you." "Not hard enough," replied Zadie, her hand on the door handle. "Because I was right here, in Chicago, in and out of the system. On the streets." Ashir glanced at his phone on the table, then back at the girl who might be his daughter. With deliberate movements, he picked up the device and walked a few steps away, dialing. "James, I need you to start an immediate investigation," he said, his voice low but authoritative. "Full background search, DNA testing, everything. Top priority." He glanced at Zadie. "Yes, it's personal. I'll explain later." Zadie watched him, suspicion darkening her features. "What are you doing?" "Making sure we know the truth," Ashir replied simply. "And business taught me to never trust emotions until facts confirm them." The bluntness of his approach, so different from Aisling's emotional reaction, struck Zadie in an unexpected way. There was something reassuring about his pragmatism. No false promises, just action. "And I don't need a DNA test to know who you are," Aisling said, approaching Zadie cautiously. "I've carried your image in my heart every day since they took you from me." She touched her half of the pendant. "This has been my reminder, my penance." Zadie looked from one to the other, the emotional mother who claimed to have been forced to give her away, the pragmatic father who hadn't known she existed. The weight of the moment, of the revelation, of 15 years of abandonment and hardship suddenly felt overwhelming. I can't do this," she whispered, feeling tears threatening. She wouldn't cry in front of them, she couldn't show that weakness. "I need to go." Before either could react, she pulled open the door and ran, past the startled assistant through the corridor toward the elevators. Behind her, she could hear Aisling calling her name, but she didn't stop. She couldn't face this, not now, not when her carefully constructed walls were crumbling around her. The elevator doors opened just as she reached them, as if fate were helping her escape. She stumbled inside, pressed the lobby button repeatedly, and leaned against the cool metal wall as the doors closed on Aisling's desperate face. As the elevator descended, Zadie felt her body shaking. The photograph, the pendants, two people who might be her parents. It was too much to process, too much to believe. And yet, as the elevator reached the lobby and she stepped out into the marble vastness, one thought kept circling in her mind. For the first time in her life, she might not be alone after all. The Chicago winter sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and deep purple as Zadie sat on a bench in Millennium Park, watching ice skaters glide across the rink. Families laughed together. Couples held hands, friends pushed each other playfully across the ice. Normal people with normal lives, something she had observed from a distance for as long as she could remember. The events at Monarch Tower replayed in her mind on an endless loop. The shock on Aisling's face, the disbelief in Ashir's eyes. The pendant, the other half of her pendant, that proved her connection to these strangers who might be her parents. She hadn't gone far after fleeing the tower. Something kept her tethered to the downtown area, as if putting physical distance between herself and the Varellas would somehow make the truth less real. She had wandered for hours, the cold eventually driving her to the relative warmth of the Art Institute, where she spent the afternoon staring at paintings without really seeing them. Now, as darkness fell over the city, Zadie found herself facing an unfamiliar dilemma. For the first time in years, she had money in her pocket, enough to get a cheap motel room, enough to eat a real meal, enough even to buy a bus ticket out of Chicago if she wanted to start over somewhere else. But the thought of leaving now, with so many unanswered questions, felt impossible. "Excuse me, miss?" A voice broke through her thoughts. An elderly security guard stood nearby, his breath visible in the cold air. "Park's closing soon. You've been sitting here for a while. Are you okay?" The concern in his voice was genuine, not the typical suspicion she encountered from authority figures. It caught her off guard. "I'm fine," she answered automatically. Just thinking." The guard nodded, unconvinced. "It's getting colder. Do you have somewhere to go?" The question hung in the air between them. Did she? Haven Shelter would have beds available, but going there felt like retreating into her old life, as if the day's revelations had never happened. "Yes," she lied. "And I'm meeting someone." "All right then." The guard gave her one last concerned look before continuing his rounds. "Take care, young lady." Young lady, not street trash, not problem. The simple dignity of the address brought an unexpected lump to her throat. Zadie pulled her new coat tighter around her body and stood, her legs stiff from sitting in the cold. Night had fully descended now, the city transformed into a landscape of lights and shadows. She began walking without a clear destination, merely seeking movement to combat the cold and quiet her racing thoughts. Her phone, a cheap prepaid model she had purchased that afternoon with some of the money, chimed with a notification. She had connected to the public library's Wi-Fi earlier and created a temporary email address. Now, a message waited in the inbox. "Zadie, I hope this reaches you. I left messages at every youth shelter in the city. Please, if you read this, call me at the number below. We need to talk. I understand if you're angry, confused, hurt. You have every right to be. But please, give us a chance to explain, to make amends if we can. Aisling." A phone number followed the brief message. Zadie stared at the screen, conflicting emotions battling within her. Part of her wanted to delete the message and disappear. Another part, a part she hardly recognized, wanted to call the number immediately. Instead, she pocketed the phone and continued walking. The night air grew colder, crystallizing her breath in front of her. Chicago in winter was merciless. She knew from bitter experience that staying outside too long could be dangerous. Eventually, she found herself standing in front of a modest hotel, not the sort of place with doormen or marble lobbies, but clean and respectable enough. Before she could second-guess herself, she walked in and approached the front desk. "I need a room for the night," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked up from her computer. "Single?" "Yes," Zadie replied, already reaching for the cash in her pocket. "ID?" Zadie froze. She had a fake ID for emergencies, but it wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. I don't have it with me," the woman sighed, regarding Zadie with a mixture of suspicion and pity. "How old are you, honey?" 18, Zadie lied, maintaining eye contact. The receptionist's expression made it clear she didn't believe her, but after a moment of consideration, she sighed again. "Room 214, $58. Checkout is at 11 a.m. Relief washed over Zadie as she handed over the cash. "Thank you. Don't make me regret this," the woman said, sliding a keycard across the counter. "No parties, no trouble." "No trouble," Zadie agreed quietly. "I promise." The room was small but clean, a double bed with a floral comforter, a nightstand with a lamp, a small desk, and a bathroom with actual hot water. To Zadie, accustomed to shelter cots and underpass concrete, it was luxury beyond measure. She showered again, letting the hot water chase away the last of the day's chill. Wrapped in a towel, she stood before the steamy bathroom mirror, studying her reflection, searching for a shear in the shape of her nose, for Aisling in the green of her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully consider the implications of the day's revelations. If what they said was true, if Aisling had been forced to give her up, if Ashir hadn't known she existed, then perhaps the narrative she had constructed about her abandonment wasn't entirely accurate. Perhaps she hadn't been unwanted, merely lost. The thought was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. If she accepted this new reality, she would have to rewrite the story of her life. She would have to acknowledge the possibility of connection, of family, of belonging. Concepts so foreign, they felt dangerous. Zadie slipped into bed, pulling the clean sheets around her. The unfamiliar comfort made sleep elusive. She reached for her phone, rereading Aisling's message. Then, almost without conscious decision, she began typing a reply. "I'm safe. I need time to think. Don't try to find me. I'll contact you when I'm ready." She hit send before she could change her mind, then turned off the phone and placed it on the nightstand. Whether it was the right decision or not, she had made it. The ball was now in motion. Morning light filtered through thin hotel curtains, painting stripes across Zadie's face. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The soft mattress, the warm blankets, the absence of traffic noise or shelter announcements, everything felt foreign. Then reality crashed back. The bag, the photo, Aisling and Ashir, the revelation. She sat up slowly, running her fingers through her tangled hair. The clock on the nightstand read 9:17 a.m. She had slept longer than she had in months, perhaps years. Her body felt different, less tense, less exhausted, though her mind remained a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. Reaching for her phone, Zadie turned it on with trepidation. 3 new messages awaited her. The first, from Aisling. "Thank you for letting me know you're safe. I understand you need space. We'll be here when you're ready. No pressure, no expectations." The second, also from Aisling, sent hours later. "I've attached my contact information and Ashir's. Also, I've arranged for a hotel room in your name at the Palmer House if you need it. No strings attached, just ask at the front desk." The third message was from an unknown number. "This is Ashir Varela. I respect your need for time, but I want you to know that I've initiated a thorough investigation into what happened 15 years ago. I intend to uncover the truth, regardless of where it leads. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me directly." Zadie stared at the messages, unsure how to feel about their different tones. Aisling's emotional outreach, Ashir's practical approach. Both were trying, in their own ways, to build a bridge to her. The question was whether she was ready to step onto it. She showered and dressed slowly, buying time against decisions that couldn't be postponed forever. Checkout was at 11, and she needed to figure out her next move. The Palmer House was tempting, a luxury hotel she'd passed countless times but never imagined entering. But accepting it felt like accepting something from them. Opening a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. After returning the keycard to the front desk, Zadie stood on the sidewalk, Chicago bustling around her. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a familiar companion that now at least she had the means to address. She walked to a nearby diner and ordered breakfast, real food, a hot meal that she didn't have to scavenge or beg for. As she ate, she scrolled through her phone, researching Aisling Donnelly and Ashir Varela. What she found confirmed what she had already gathered. Aisling ran the Donnelly Foundation, a non-profit focused on youth in crisis, foster kids, runaways, troubled teens. The irony wasn't lost on Zadie. Ashir was the CEO of Varela Development, one of the largest real estate development companies in the Midwest. Both were successful, respected figures in Chicago's business community. And they were married to each other. The biological parents she never knew had found each other again, built lives together, all while she bounced between foster homes and eventually the streets. The unfairness of it threatened to choke her. She pushed away her half-eaten breakfast, appetite gone. Outside the diner, snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes swirling in the wind. Zadie stood watching it for a moment, then made a decision. She would go to the Palmer House, not to stay, but to face Aisling on neutral ground. She needed answers more than she needed safety or comfort. The lobby of the Palmer House was everything Zadie had imagined and more. Ornate ceiling, plush carpets, chandeliers, staff in crisp uniforms. She felt profoundly out of place despite her new clothes, certain that everyone could see through her thin veneer of respectability to the street kid beneath. "May I help you?" asked the impeccably dressed man at the front desk, his expression professionally neutral. "I believe there's a room reserved for me," Zadie said, forcing confidence into her voice. "Under the name Zadie." The man typed something into his computer, then looked up with a smile that seemed more genuine than before. "Ah, yes. Ms. Donnelly Varela left specific instructions. You're in suite 1204. Would you like assistance with your luggage?" "I don't have any," Zadie replied, uncomfortably aware of how odd that must sound for someone checking into a luxury hotel. If the clerk found this strange, he didn't show it. "Very well, here's your key card. The elevators are to your right. If you need anything at all during your stay, please don't hesitate to call the front desk." The suite was bigger than any apartment Zadie had ever lived in. A spacious living room with elegant furniture led to a bedroom with a king-size bed and a bathroom with both a shower and a deep soaking tub. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city. On the coffee table sat a vase of fresh flowers and an envelope with her name written on it in elegant handwriting. Inside was a note. "Zadie, I've arranged for this suite to be available to you for as long as you need it. There's a credit line established at the hotel for room service and incidentals. No strings attached, I promise. This is not about buying your forgiveness or your trust. Those can't be purchased. This is simply about making sure you have a safe, comfortable place while you decide what you want to do next. I'll be in the hotel restaurant at 1 p.m. today if you'd like to talk. If not, I understand. This is all on your terms now." Aisling Zadie checked the time. 12:45. Aisling would be downstairs soon, perhaps was already there, waiting. The thought sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. She went to the bathroom and assessed her appearance. The second-hand clothes she'd bought weren't inappropriate exactly, but they wouldn't help her feel confident in a fancy hotel restaurant. To her surprise, the closet in the bedroom contained several shopping bags. Inside were jeans, tops, sweaters, a new coat, even boots, all in what appeared to be her size. Another note explained, "I wasn't sure what you might need. If nothing here works for you, please charge whatever you'd like to the room." Zadie ran her hand over the soft fabrics, conflicted. Part of her wanted to reject these offerings out of principle, to refuse to be bought. Another part recognized the practicality of having appropriate clothes, and a small, quiet part, a part she barely acknowledged, was simply grateful for the kindness of the gesture. In the end, pragmatism won. She changed into new jeans and a deep green sweater that matched her eyes, brushed her hair with the provided brush, and took a deep breath. Then she headed downstairs to meet the woman who claimed to be her mother. The restaurant was elegant, but not intimidating, with well-spaced tables and soft lighting. Aisling sat alone at a corner table, absently stirring a cup of tea. She wasn't typing on a phone or reading papers. She was simply waiting, her attention undivided, her body language betraying her nervousness. When she spotted Zadie, her face transformed, hope, fear, and joy flooding her features in rapid succession. She stood, then seemed unsure whether to approach or stay put. Zadie made the decision for her, walking directly to the table. "You came," Aisling said softly, as if afraid speaking too loudly might scare Zadie away. "I have questions," Zadie replied, sitting down across from her. "A lot of them." "Of course," Aisling nodded. "I'll answer everything I can." A waiter appeared, and Zadie ordered a hot chocolate, needing something to do with her hands. When he left, silence fell between them, a weighted, expectant silence full of 15 years of absence. "Where's Ashir?" Zadie finally asked. "He wanted to come," Aisling explained, "but we thought it might be less overwhelming this way, one of us at a time." She hesitated. "He's taking this very hard. The fact that he never knew about you, that we met again 5 years ago, and I didn't tell him." "Why didn't you?" The question had been burning in Zadie since the revelation at the tower. "If you suspected who he was, why keep it a secret?" Aisling's hands tightened around her teacup. "By the time I realized who he was, that he had been the exchange student from my past, we were already falling in love. I was terrified of losing him, of him hating me for what happened, and I truly believed you were with a good family. That's what my grandfather promised." "Your grandfather?" Zadie repeated. "Tell me about him, about what happened." Aisling's face darkened. "Hugh Finnegan. He was a powerful man in Irish politics, conservative, traditional, obsessed with appearances. When I got pregnant at 16, he saw it as a stain on the family name. The fact that the father was Turkish made it worse in his eyes." She looked down at her tea. "He arranged everything, told me I had no choice, that if I didn't cooperate, he would destroy Ashir's family in Turkey, ruin any chance he had at a future. So you just gave me away." "I fought," Aisling insisted, her eyes glistening. "I begged to keep you. I was young and scared, but I wanted you, Zadie. When that didn't work, I asked to at least ensure you would go to a specific family, one I could check on. He refused. I said it was better for everyone if there was a clean break." The waiter returned with Zadie's hot chocolate, momentarily interrupting the intensity of their exchange. Zadie took a sip, the rich sweetness a stark contrast to the bitter conversation. "The pendant," she said, touching the half-moon through her sweater. "You said you left it with me." Aisling nodded, her own hand reflexively reaching for her neck. "It was my grandmother's, my mother's mother, not from my grandfather's side. She gave it to me when I was born. When they took you away, I managed to slip it around your neck. I broke it in half first. One for you, one for me." "Why?" "Because I promised myself I would find you someday." A tear slipped down Aisling's cheek. "I tried, Zadie. When I turned 18 and was no longer under my grandfather's control, I started looking. But the adoption records were sealed, and he had used his connections to ensure they stayed that way. I hired private investigators, but they kept hitting walls." "So you gave up?" Zadie said flatly. "Never." Aisling's voice was suddenly fierce. "I never gave up. I established the foundation partly as a way to help other kids, but also to create a network to increase my chances of finding you. Every year on your birthday, I would update the search parameters, expand the resources allocated. Zadie processed this, trying to reconcile it with her experiences. I wasn't exactly hidden. I was in the system right here in Chicago. Names get changed in the system, Aisling explained. Records get lost or misplaced, especially when children move between homes frequently without knowing your adopted name or having access to your birth records. Even being in the same city wasn't enough. Silence fell between them again as Zadie contemplated this. It was a plausible explanation, but accepting it meant accepting that her abandonment wasn't the simple act of rejection she had always believed it to be. It meant opening herself to the possibility of a more complicated truth, one where people had looked for her, had wanted her. I was adopted by the Millers when I was 6, Zadie said finally. They changed my name to Jessica Miller. That lasted about 8 months before they decided I was too difficult and sent me back. After that, it was the Thompsons, the Donovans. They were the ones who burned me with cigarettes, the Wilsons, the Chens, and finally the Hargroves. She delivered this history in a detached voice, as if reading from someone else's biography. I ran away from the Hargroves when I was 12. Mr. Hargrove had wandering hands. Aisling's face had grown increasingly pale as Zadie spoke, her hands now covering her mouth in horror. "Oh God," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I've been on the street since then," Zadie continued. "Sometimes in shelters when it gets too cold, but mostly on my own. I learned to be invisible, to survive." "And now?" Aisling asked hesitantly. "What do you want now, Zadie?" It was the question Zadie had been asking herself since finding the photograph, and she still didn't have a clear answer. What did she want? Revenge? Understanding? A family? The very concept seemed foreign, dangerous. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm not sure I can just become your daughter or a Shears. I don't know how to be that." "We don't expect you to," Aisling said quickly. "We don't expect anything. This is all on your terms. If you want to know us, we're here. If you just want answers, we'll give them. If you need time or space, we'll respect that." Zadie studied Aisling's face, searching for deception or manipulation, but finding only sincerity and barely contained hope. "And if I decide I want nothing to do with either of you?" The question clearly pained Aisling, but she answered steadily. "Then we'll accept that too. But we'll still make sure you're taken care of, that you have what you need to build whatever life you want." "I don't need charity," Zadie said sharply. "It's not charity," Aisling countered. "It's responsibility. It's the very least we can do." The conversation was interrupted by Aisling's phone vibrating on the table. She glanced at it, then looked up with an expression of surprise. "It's a Shear. He says..." She paused, reading. "He says he has information about what happened after you were born, about how you ended up in the system here in Chicago." Zadie felt her heart skip a beat. "What kind of information?" "He doesn't say, just that it's important." Aisling looked up from her phone. "He's asking if he can join us, if you're ready to see him." Zadie hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay." As they waited for a Shear to arrive, Zadie felt a strange sensation settle over her. Not quite acceptance, not quite hope, but something adjacent to both. A willingness to listen, to learn, to possibly begin constructing a new understanding of her past. And with it, perhaps, a new vision of her future. A Shear Varela entered the restaurant with a presence that turned heads. Even in casual clothes, dark jeans and a charcoal sweater instead of his usual suit, he carried himself with the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to power. He spotted them immediately, his stride purposeful as he approached their table. What struck Zadie most was the way his composure seemed to falter slightly when their eyes met, a brief but noticeable crack in his armor. There was uncertainty there, maybe even fear. Emotions she wouldn't have associated with a man of his stature. Zadie, he said, her name careful on his tongue, like he was still getting used to saying it. Ah, thank you for agreeing to see me. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Up close, the resemblance between them was even more apparent, the same high cheekbones, the same slight arch to their eyebrows. His skin was darker, his eyes brown instead of green, but there was no denying the genetic connection. Ashir sat down beside Aisling, placing a leather portfolio on the table. I have information, he said without preamble, about what happened after you were born. What kind of information? Zadie asked, tension coiling in her stomach. I have a team of very thorough investigators, Ashir explained. The kind who can find things that others can't or won't. He opened the portfolio and removed several documents. When Aisling told me about her grandfather, Hugh Finnegan, I had them focus on him first. They discovered a pattern of financial transactions from his accounts to various officials in the adoption system, both in Ireland and the United States. He was paying people off, Aisling asked, clearly horrified. Yes, Ashir's voice was tight with controlled anger. But that's just the beginning. The adoption you thought you were signing for, Aisling, the one that was supposed to place Zadie with a stable, loving family, never happened. What do you mean? Aisling's face had gone pale. I mean, there was no adoption. Not officially. Ashir slid a document across the table. This is a copy of what you actually signed. It wasn't an adoption consent form. It was a relinquishment of parental rights. After that, Finnegan arranged for Zadie to be transported to the United States and placed directly into the foster care system here in Chicago. Why? Zadie asked, struggling to comprehend. Why go to all that trouble? Ashir's expression darkened further. Control. By keeping you in the system rather than with an adoptive family, he ensured that if Aisling ever tried to find you, the trail would be nearly impossible to follow. Foster children move frequently. Records get misplaced or sealed. But more importantly, by placing you in another country, he made sure that even if Aisling somehow discovered what he'd done, she would face significant legal hurdles in trying to reclaim you. Aisling's hands were trembling so badly that she had to set down her teacup. He told me, her voice broke, he told me she would have a better life, that a young, stable couple was waiting to adopt her, that they would give her everything I couldn't. He lied, Ashir said simply. He had no intention of giving Zadie to a permanent family. The entire plan was designed to make you believe she was safe and loved while ensuring you would never find her again. Zadie felt as if the floor beneath her was tilting. All those years in foster care, all those transfers from one home to another, all the abuse and neglect, none of it had been necessary. She had never been an unwanted child waiting for adoption. She had been deliberately placed in a system designed to lose her. There's more, Ashir continued, his voice gentler now. When my team looked into your foster care history, they found irregularities. Normally, a child with your background, healthy, young, with no significant behavioral issues documented in your early files, would have been considered highly adoptable. Several families expressed interest in adopting you permanently. Yet each time the process was mysteriously derailed. What are you saying? Zadie asked, though she already suspected the answer. I'm saying someone was interfering. Ashir's eyes were flat with anger. Someone with influence was ensuring you remained in the system, monitoring your whereabouts but preventing any permanent placement. Finnegan, Aisling whispered, horror dawning in her expression. He was making sure I could never find her, even if I discovered what he'd done. Yes, Ashir confirmed, until 3 years ago. What happened 3 years ago? Zadie asked. Hugh Finnegan died, Aisling answered, understanding spreading across her features. 3 years ago, in his sleep. After his death, the interference stopped, Ashir explained. But by then I was already on the streets, Zadie finished. I'd already run away from the Hargroves. The bitter irony of it all threatened to choke her. So what you're saying is that all of this, everything I went through, was just some old man's plan to hide me from my mother. Yes, Ashir said simply, adjourned to punish her for what he perceived as her transgression. Silence fell over the table as all three of them absorbed the magnitude of this revelation. Zadie felt dizzy with the implications, with the senseless cruelty of it all. For 15 years, her life had been shaped by a man she'd never met, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. "And I'm going to destroy what's left of his reputation," Aisling said suddenly, her voice ice-cold. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what he did." "That won't change what happened," Zadie pointed out, surprised by the calm in her own voice. "No, it won't," Aisling agreed. "Nothing can change that. But he doesn't deserve to be remembered as the great statesman, the pillar of the community. Not after what he did to you, to us." Ashir placed his hand over Aisling's, a gesture of solidarity that caught Zadie's attention. Despite everything that had happened, despite the secrets Aisling had kept from him, they still presented a united front. There was something both admirable and painful about witnessing their connection. "What happens now?" Zadie asked, the question directed at both of them but also at herself. Ashir and Aisling exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "That depends on what you want, Zadie," Ashir said finally. "Legally, you're still a minor. We could petition for guardianship. You could come live with us. Or we could arrange for you to have your own place, with support but independence. Or," he hesitated, "or we could simply ensure you have the resources you need and otherwise respect your wish for distance, if that's what you prefer." The options hung in the air between them, each representing a different possible future. Zadie found herself unable to immediately respond, the weight of the choice overwhelming. "You don't have to decide right now," Aisling added gently. "Take all the time you need. Stay at the hotel, think things through. There's no rush, no pressure." Zadie nodded, grateful for the reprieve, but also aware that she couldn't postpone this decision indefinitely. Sooner or later, she would have to choose a path forward. "I have one more question," she said, looking directly at Ashir. "When you found out about me yesterday, when you realized I might be your daughter, what did you feel?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Shock at first," he answered honestly. "Then anger, not at you, but at the circumstances, at the lost time, and then—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Then a kind of recognition. Looking at you was like seeing a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. It felt true." His answer, unexpected in its vulnerability, touched something in Zadie. Of all the things he could have said, duty, responsibility, obligation, he had chosen to speak of recognition, of truth. It wasn't an emotional declaration of instant paternal love, but there was something more authentic in its restraint. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the investigation, for finding out what really happened." "It's the least I could do," Ashir replied. "There's more to uncover, more people to hold accountable. I intend to pursue this to the end." Zadie believed him. Something in his determined expression told her that Hugh Finnegan's co-conspirators would eventually face consequences for their actions. It was a small consolation, but a consolation nonetheless. As they finished their meal, conversation shifted to more neutral topics. Zadie's education, interrupted but not entirely neglected thanks to public libraries and her own determination. Her interests, art, particularly drawing, which she pursued with scavenged materials whenever possible. Her immediate needs, which she was reluctant to discuss, but which Ashir and Aisling were gently insistent about addressing. By the time they parted, something had shifted subtly in the dynamic between them. Not trust exactly, that would take much longer to build, but perhaps the foundations for it, a mutual recognition that whatever happened next, the truth of their connection could no longer be denied or ignored. In the elevator back to her suite, Zadie felt both emotionally exhausted and strangely liberated. The narrative of her life, the story she had told herself about being unwanted, abandoned, had been complicated by these new revelations. The truth was both better and worse than she had imagined. She had not been carelessly discarded, but deliberately hidden, not forgotten, but actively sought. In her room, she stood at the window overlooking the city, her city, the place where she had survived against considerable odds. Chicago sprawled before her, familiar and strange all at once, just like her newly discovered parents, just like her newly complicated identity. She touched the half-moon pendant at her neck, considering its newfound significance. No longer just a mysterious keepsake, it was now a symbol of a connection that had endured, despite everything designed to sever it. Whether she was ready to embrace that connection fully was still uncertain, but for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility. 3 days passed in a strange limbo. Zadie remained at the Palmer house, sleeping in a bed softer than any she'd known, eating food she didn't have to scavenge, showering whenever she wanted. Luxuries so basic to most people, but so foreign to her, that they still felt surreal. Aisling called each day, her voice careful, never pushing, but always present. Ashir sent texts, updates on his investigation, offers of help that never crossed into demands. They were giving her space, as promised, allowing her to set the pace of whatever this was becoming. On the 4th morning, Zadie woke early, the city still dark beyond her window. She had been dreaming of something she couldn't quite remember. Fragments of memory, perhaps, or things she wished she could remember. A kitchen with sunlight streaming through curtains, the smell of spices, a woman's laugh, a man's deep voice singing in a language she didn't understand. She dressed in some of the new clothes Aisling had provided, clothes that fit better than anything she'd worn in years, and headed downstairs. The lobby was quiet at this hour, just a few business travelers checking out for early flights. "Good morning, Ms. Zadie," said the front desk clerk, a young man with a name tag that read Thomas. "Can I get you anything this morning?" It still startled her, this treatment, being addressed with respect, being seen as a person worthy of consideration rather than a problem to be moved along. "No, thank you," she replied. "I'm just going for a walk." Outside, Chicago was waking up. Delivery trucks rumbled along streets, early commuters hurried toward train stations, coffee shops began to fill with the before-work crowd. Zadie walked without a specific destination, simply absorbing the familiar city from this unfamiliar perspective. No longer a shadow person to be avoided, but someone with a right to occupy space. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A text from Ashir. "DNA results confirmed what we already knew. You are, without question, our daughter. I've prepared legal documents to establish guardianship if that's what you want. No pressure, just letting you know options are available when you're ready." Zadie stopped walking, the confirmation washing over her in an unexpected wave of emotion. Of course she had known. The pendants, the photo, the resemblance, the timeline, all made it clear. But seeing it stated so plainly, backed by science, made it undeniable in a new way. She found herself outside the Art Institute, a place she had sometimes sneaked into on free admission days, losing herself for hours in worlds created by brushstrokes and vision. The museum wouldn't open for hours yet, but she sat on the steps, watching the morning light change the colors of the city. Another text chimed, this one from Aisling. "Good morning. I'm heading to the Haven shelter today to discuss expanding our support program. I thought, maybe you might want to come, see what we do. No pressure at all. Just an open invitation. The Haven shelter." Zadie knew it well, had slept there on particularly cold nights, had eaten meals there when hunger overcame pride. It was one of the better shelters, cleaner than most, with staff who treated people with dignity. She hadn't realized Aisling's foundation was connected to it. Before she could overthink it, she texted back, "What time?" The reply came almost immediately. "I'll be there at 10. Could meet you outside if that works for you." Zadie hesitated, then typed, "Okay, see you then." She had 2 hours to kill, so she walked to a nearby cafe, ordered breakfast with the hotel credit card Aisling had arranged for her, and tried to quiet the anxiety building in her chest. This would be the first time she had voluntarily sought out either of her newfound parents, the first step she had taken toward them rather than away. At precisely 10 a.m., Zadie stood across the street from Haven Shelter, watching as Aisling arrived. The woman moved differently here than she had at the hotel or at Monarch Tower. Less the polished executive, more someone familiar with the realities of the place. She greeted the security guard by name, stopped to chat with a homeless man sitting on the steps, her body language open and engaged. Zadie crossed the street, approaching quietly. Aisling spotted her and smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes but remained careful, not presuming too much. "You came," she said simply. "I know this place," Zadie replied. "I've stayed here sometimes when it gets too cold outside." A shadow of pain crossed Aisling's face, but she quickly composed herself. "It's one of the better shelters in the city. We've been working with them for about 3 years now." "We? The Foundation?" Aisling gestured toward the entrance. "Shall we go in?" Inside, the shelter was much as Zadie remembered it, clean but institutional, with the particular smell of industrial cleaner and too many bodies in too little space. What surprised her was how many staff members greeted Aisling warmly, with the familiarity of long association. "Miss Donnelly, good to see you," called out a large black woman whom Zadie recognized as one of the night supervisors. "And who's this with you today?" Aisling glanced at Zadie, clearly unsure how to introduce her. "I am Zadie," she said, taking the decision out of Aisling's hands. "I've stayed here before." "Well, welcome back, honey," the woman said, her eyes kind but observant, clearly noting the difference in Zadie's appearance now compared to her previous visits. "I'm Gloria. If you need anything, you just let me know." As they continued through the facility, Zadie observed Aisling in this environment. She knew the layout, knew many of the residents and staff by name, asked specific questions about individual cases and needs. This wasn't a wealthy benefactor making a rare appearance. This was someone deeply involved in the day-to-day operations. They entered a conference room where several people were already gathered. Shelter administrators, a couple of social workers, and a man in a suit who was introduced as the Foundation's program director. "Everyone, this is Zadie," Aisling said. "She'll be joining us today as an observer." The meeting proceeded, focused on expanding the shelter's transitional housing program for teens aging out of foster care. Zadie listened, increasingly surprised by the depth of understanding Aisling and her team demonstrated about the challenges these young people faced. The bureaucratic hurdles, the psychological impacts of institutional living, the practical difficulties of establishing independence without family support. "The problem isn't just housing," one of the social workers was saying. "It's the isolation. These kids have no safety net, no one to call when things go wrong." "Which is why the mentorship component is so crucial," Aisling replied. "Housing alone isn't enough. They need connections, people they can trust and rely on." Something in her words resonated with Zadie, hitting closer to home than Aisling could possibly know. Or maybe she did know. Maybe that was precisely why she had invited Zadie today, to show her this side of herself, this work that seemed to directly address the very problems Zadie had faced. After the meeting, Aisling gave her a tour of the newer parts of the facility, a computer lab for job searches and education, a medical clinic staffed by volunteer doctors, private counseling rooms for mental health support. "How long have you been doing this?" Zadie asked, as they stood in a recently renovated dormitory space designed specifically for young women. "The Foundation's been operating for 7 years, Aisling replied. But I started volunteering with youth organizations when I was in college. Because of me?" The question slipped out before Zadie could reconsider it. Aisling was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Yes and no. After what happened with you, I became aware in a way I hadn't been before. Aware of systems that fail children, of the damage that can be done by those with power over the vulnerable." She looked directly at Zadie. But it wasn't just about assuaging guilt or making amends. The more I learned, the more I saw how many young people were falling through the cracks. It became a mission, a purpose. Zadie nodded, not entirely sure how to feel about this. On one hand, it was admirable. Aisling had channeled her personal loss into helping others. On the other hand, there was something almost painful about knowing that other homeless teens had benefited from resources that might have helped Zadie herself, had they found each other sooner. "Do you want to see the art room?" Aisling asked, breaking into Zadie's thoughts. "We recently expanded it based on feedback from some of the younger residents." The art room was bright and welcoming, with large tables, good lighting, and surprisingly high-quality supplies. Several teens were already there, working on various projects under the guidance of a young woman with purple hair. "Hey, Ms. D," the woman called out when she saw Aisling. "Perfect timing. We just got that shipment of canvas boards you ordered." "Wonderful," Aisling replied. "Maya, this is Zadie. Zadie, Maya runs our arts program." "Cool," Maya said with a friendly nod. "You an artist?" "Sometimes," Zadie admitted. "Dumb when I can find materials." "Well, help yourself to anything here," Maya offered. "We're always looking for new perspectives." For the next hour, Zadie found herself sitting at one of the tables, sketching with proper pencils and paper for the first time in months. She was acutely aware of Aisling watching her from across the room, where she was chatting with Maya and some of the other teens, but the familiar motion of creating something from nothing soon absorbed her attention. When Aisling finally approached, Zadie had completed a detailed sketch of the Chicago skyline, as seen from beneath the very overpass where she had often slept, a perspective few would recognize, but which contained its own stark beauty. "That's incredible," Aisling said softly, genuine admiration in her voice. "You have real talent." Zadie shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise, but also quietly pleased. "Just something I do sometimes." "Have you ever had formal training?" "Not really. I took some classes in school before." She didn't need to finish the sentence. "Before running away, before the streets. And I mostly learned from books and watching people." Aisling seemed about to say something more, but was interrupted by her phone ringing. She checked the screen. "It's Ashir. Do you mind if I take this?" Zadie shook her head, and Aisling stepped away to answer. Though she spoke quietly, Zadie could still hear her side of the conversation. "Yes, she's with me at Haven. No, I think it's going well, really. Are you sure? That's significant. Have you told her yet?" "Okay, I understand. Yes, we'll talk about it tonight." When she returned, her expression was carefully neutral, but Zadie could sense underlying tension. "Everything okay?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "Just some developments in Ashir's investigation," Aisling replied. "Nothing to worry about right now." But something in her tone suggested otherwise. Zadie considered pushing for more information, but decided against it. Whatever it was, she would likely find out soon enough. As they prepared to leave the shelter, Zadie found herself unexpectedly reluctant to go. Despite the institutional nature of the place, there was something honest about it, a reality she understood, people whose struggles mirrored her own. The Palmer house, with all its luxury, felt like a fantasy by comparison, a temporary reprieve from the world she knew. "Thank you for coming today," Aisling said as they stood outside. "It meant a lot to me that you wanted to see this part of my life. Your foundation does good work," Zadie acknowledged, discomfort and gratitude warring within her. A brief silence fell between them, neither quite sure how to proceed. "Would you," Aisling began hesitantly, "would you like to come to our home for dinner tonight? Ashir would be there, and there are some things we'd like to discuss with you, but only if you feel ready." The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. Going to their home would be crossing another threshold, moving from neutral territory to their personal space, accepting another level of connection. What things?" Zadie asked cautiously. "Legal options mostly," Aisling explained. "And some information Ashir has uncovered that he wants to share in person," she hurried to add. But we can also discuss it at the hotel or anywhere you'd be more comfortable. Zadie considered her options. She was curious about what Ashir had discovered, and some part of her was also curious about their home, about how they lived when not in hotel restaurants or corporate towers. Okay, she decided. Dinner. Aisling's face brightened, though she tried to temper her reaction. Wonderful. Is 7 o'clock all right? I can send a car for you or meet you in the hotel lobby if you prefer. I can get there myself, Zadie said, maintaining at least that much independence. Just text me the address. As they parted ways, Zadie felt the strange dual sensation that had become familiar over the past few days. The pull toward these people who shared her blood, coupled with the ingrained instinct to maintain distance, to protect herself from potential disappointment or rejection. Walking back toward the hotel, she realized that for the first time since finding the photograph, she was actively choosing to move toward her newfound parents rather than being drawn in by circumstances. Whether this was progress or folly remained to be seen, but it was undeniably a choice, something she had too rarely been granted in her young life. The address Aisling texted led Zadie to a brownstone in Lincoln Park, one of Chicago's most affluent neighborhoods. It wasn't ostentatious, no gates or obvious security, just a well-maintained historic home on a tree-lined street. Still, Zadie calculated that it probably cost more than she would earn in several lifetimes. She stood on the sidewalk, studying the warm light spilling from the windows, gathering her courage. This wasn't a public space like the hotel or restaurant. This was their territory, their private world. Entering it felt significant in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Before she could second-guess herself, she walked up the steps and rang the bell. Moments later, Ashir opened the door. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a simple sweater, looking more relaxed than she had seen him previously. "Zadie," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I'm glad you came." He stepped back to let her enter, careful not to crowd her or make any presumptive gestures like a hug or even a handshake. She appreciated his awareness of her boundaries. The interior of the house was surprisingly warm and unpretentious. Hardwood floors with colorful rugs, comfortable-looking furniture, artwork that appeared chosen for personal taste rather than investment value. It felt lived in, welcoming in a way Zadie hadn't expected. "Aisling's in the kitchen," Ashir said, leading the way through the house. "She insisted on cooking herself tonight, despite my concerns about potential fire hazards." His dry humor caught Zadie off guard, offering a glimpse of a personality beyond the controlled executive demeanor she had observed previously. The kitchen was large and open, with a central island where Aisling was arranging what looked like a cheese board. She looked up when they entered, a smile spreading across her face. "You made it," she said, setting down the knife she was using. "I'm so glad." "Something smells good," Zadie offered, searching for neutral conversation. "Don't sound so surprised," Aisling laughed. "I'm not completely hopeless in the kitchen, just mostly." "She's being modest," Ashir said, moving to pour water from a filtered pitcher. "She makes exactly 3 dishes extremely well and burns everything else. Tonight, fortunately, is one of the 3. Their easy banter, the gentle teasing, revealed a rapport that Zadie found unexpectedly affecting. This was what a marriage looked like from the inside, this comfort, this familiarity. She had witnessed precious few healthy relationships in her life, and never from this intimate vantage point. "Would you like something to drink?" Ashir asked. "Water, soda, juice?" "Water is fine," Zadie replied, still taking in her surroundings. Over by the refrigerator, she noticed a wall covered with photographs, Ashir and Aisling in various locations around the world, with various people at various events, a visual history of their life together. She moved closer to examine them, drawn by curiosity. "That was our trip to Istanbul last year," Ashir explained, noticing her interest in a particular photo of them on a boat with a dramatic skyline behind them. "To meet my family." "Your family," Zadie repeated. "And in Turkey." A new realization struck her. She had grandparents, possibly aunts, uncles, cousins, an entire extended family she had never considered. Yes, Ashir confirmed, my parents still live there, along with my sister and her children. Do they... Zaidi hesitated. Do they know about me? The question hung heavily in the air. Ashir exchanged a quick glance with Aisling before answering. Not yet, he said honestly. We wanted to respect your privacy, to let you decide how much you want to be involved before involving others. But my family would be overjoyed to know about you whenever you're ready. Zaidi nodded, appreciating his candor and the respect for her agency. She continued scanning the photos, pausing at one that showed Aisling with an older woman who had the same vibrant red hair, though streaked with silver. My mother, Aisling said softly, coming to stand beside Zaidi. Your grandmother, she lives in Boston now. Does she know? Zaidi asked, not looking away from the photo. Yes, Aisling admitted. I called her the day after we met. She cried. She never approved of what her father, my grandfather, did. They were estranged for years because of it. She would love to meet you, but only when and if you're ready. The existence of these extended family members, people connected to her by blood but completely unknown to her, was both overwhelming and strangely compelling. For someone who had grown up believing herself alone in the world, the sudden expansion of her family tree was dizzying. Dinner should be ready, Aisling said, moving back to the stove. Would you mind helping me set the table, Ashir? The three of them moved into a dining room adjacent to the kitchen. The table was already partially set with what looked like good china, but not overly formal. Zaidi got the impression they had tried to strike a balance, making an effort to mark the occasion as special without creating intimidating formality. Once they were seated with plates of aromatic lamb stew and fresh bread before them, conversation flowed more easily than Zaidi had expected. Ashir and Aisling seemed to have tacitly agreed not to interrogate her, instead sharing stories about themselves, offering information freely without demanding reciprocation. So you're a real estate developer, Zaidi said to Ashir during a lull in conversation. What exactly does that mean? In simple terms, I find underutilized properties and transform them into something more valuable, he explained. Sometimes that means renovating historic buildings, sometimes creating entirely new structures. My company specializes in mixed-use developments, combining residential, commercial, and community spaces. Like gentrification? Zaidi asked bluntly, thinking of neighborhoods she had watched transform, pushing out long-time residents who could no longer afford to stay. To his credit, Ashir didn't bristle at the challenge. That's a fair question. Development can certainly contribute to gentrification when done carelessly or with profit as the only motive. It's something I've become more conscious of over the years. He hesitated, then added, in fact, one of our current initiatives focuses on creating affordable housing units within each new development, ensuring that economic diversity is maintained in changing neighborhoods. Zaidi nodded, surprised by his thoughtful response. She had expected corporate defensiveness, not acknowledgement of the complexity. Enough about work, Aisling interjected gently. Zaidi, Ashir mentioned you're interested in art. Have you always enjoyed drawing? The conversation shifted to safer territory. Zaidi's interest in art, books she had read, places in Chicago she knew well. By the time they moved to dessert, a simple but delicious apple crumble, Zaidi found herself more relaxed than she had anticipated, though still acutely aware that they were circling around the more significant topics that awaited discussion. As Aisling cleared the dessert plates, Ashir's expression grew more serious. Zaidi, there are some legal matters we should discuss if you're comfortable with that now. She nodded, bracing herself. That's part of why I came. First, he began, as I mentioned in my text, the DNA results confirmed what we already knew. Legally, this gives us options. As your biological parents, we can petition for guardianship until you turn 18. This would provide you with certain protections and benefits, health insurance, legal residency, educational opportunities. Would I have to live with you? Zadie asked, the question direct but not hostile. Not necessarily, Aisling replied, returning from the kitchen. We would be your legal guardians, but arrangements could be flexible based on what you're comfortable with. You could stay with us, or we could set up a separate living situation with appropriate support. Zadie considered this. The practical benefits of legal guardianship were undeniable. Stability, security, resources she had never had access to before. But it also meant official recognition of a relationship she was still coming to terms with emotionally. The second matter, Ashir continued, relates to my ongoing investigation. I've uncovered information that may be difficult to hear, but I believe you deserve to know. Zadie tensed. What is it? Ashir leaned forward slightly. Hugh Finnegan, Aisling's grandfather, didn't act alone in what happened to you. He had help, specifically from a man named Robert Hargrove. The name hit Zadie like a physical blow. Mr. Hargrove, my last foster father? Yes, Ashir confirmed grimly. It appears that Hargrove was part of Finnegan's network. He was paid specifically to take you in, to keep you in the system but under observation. What? Zadie's voice was barely above a whisper, the implications landing like stones. Are you saying he knew who I was? That he was watching me for Finnegan? That's exactly what I'm saying, Ashir replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. Hargrove received regular payments from a shell company we've now traced back to Finnegan. The payments continued until Finnegan's death 3 years ago. The revelation sent Zadie's mind spinning. Her last foster home, the place she had fled at 12, hadn't been a random placement. Hargrove had known who she was, had been part of the plan to keep her hidden. His wandering hands, his increasingly inappropriate behavior, had that been part of the plan too? Or just the actions of a predator given access to a vulnerable child? There's more, Ashir continued, his eyes showing concern at her reaction but pressing on. After you ran away, Hargrove reported you missing as required by law, but our investigation indicates he deliberately sabotaged efforts to find you. He provided false information, misdirected searches, essentially ensuring you wouldn't be found and brought back into the system. Why? Zadie managed to ask through the shock. Why would he do that? We don't know for certain, Ashir admitted. But my theory is that once you were gone, it was actually more convenient for everyone involved. Finnegan still had you effectively hidden from Aisling, but without the liability of having you under Hargrove's roof, where questions might eventually be asked. And after Finnegan died? Zadie asked. Why didn't Hargrove try to find me then? By that point, you had been missing for almost a year, Aisling explained gently. Yet the case had gone cold, and without Finnegan's payments, Hargrove had no financial incentive to continue involvement. Zadie sat in stunned silence, trying to process this new layer of betrayal. The system she had believed was merely indifferent to her fate had actually been actively corrupted. People who should have protected her had instead been complicit in her isolation and vulnerability. I want him punished, she said finally, her voice low but firm. Hargrove, I want him to pay for what he did. He will, Ashir promised, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Since my legal team is preparing a case against him, fraud, child endangerment, criminal conspiracy, he won't get away with this. But that's not all, Aisling added, reaching across the table, though stopping short of touching Zadie's hand. We want to make this right, as much as is possible. We can't give you back the years that were taken, but we can ensure your future is secure. How? Zadie asked, still reeling from the revelations. First, by becoming your legal guardians if you'll allow it, Aisling said. Second, by establishing a trust for you that will provide for your education and other needs. And third, she glanced at Ashir, who nodded encouragingly. By offering you a home, either with us or in a place of your own, whatever feels right to you. The offer hung in the air, weighty with implication. It wasn't just about material support, it was about belonging, about claiming her rightful place in a family that until days ago she hadn't known existed. "I don't know what to say," Zadie admitted, overwhelmed by the dual shock of Hargrove's betrayal and the scope of what Ashir and Aisling were offering. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Ashir assured her. "These options will remain available to you. Take all the time you need to consider what feels right for you." Zadie nodded, grateful for the lack of pressure, but also aware that decisions would eventually need to be made. The limbo she had been living in, neither street kid nor daughter, neither alone nor connected, couldn't continue indefinitely. "There's one more thing," Aisling said softly. "Something I've been wanting to give you but was waiting for the right moment." She left the room briefly, returning with a small wooden box. Placing it on the table in front of Zadie, she stepped back, giving her space. "What is this?" Zadie asked, eyeing the box cautiously. "Open it," Aisling encouraged gently. "Please." With hesitant fingers, Zadie lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of items: a tiny knit hat, impossibly small, a hospital bracelet marked Baby Girl Donnelly, a lock of dark hair tied with blue thread, several photographs of a newborn baby clearly taken in a hospital, and a handwritten letter in an unsealed envelope. "And these are the only things I was able to keep," Aisling explained, her voice thick with emotion. "The only physical proof that you had existed, that you weren't just a dream I'd had." Zadie picked up one of the photographs with trembling hands. The image showed a much younger Aisling, exhausted but radiant, holding a swaddled infant against her chest. The love in her expression was unmistakable, unshadowed yet by the separation that would follow. "You can read the letter now, or later, or never," Aisling added. "It's up to you. I wrote it the day after they took you, when I still believed you were going to a loving adoptive home. I never thought I'd actually be able to give it to you." Zadie carefully returned the photo to the box, her emotions too complex to untangle in this moment. "I'll read it later," she decided, gently closing the lid. "Thank you for keeping these things." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared history, both acknowledged and still unfolding, palpable in the room. Then Ashir spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Zadie, whatever you decide about guardianship, living arrangements, or how much contact you want with us, I want you to know one thing with absolute certainty. You are not alone anymore. You have family now, people who will fight for you, support you, stand by you. That doesn't change, regardless of legal documents or living situations." His words, so simple yet so profound, broke through the last of Zadie's carefully constructed defenses. For 15 years, she had been alone, navigating a world that had often been indifferent at best and cruel at worst. The promise of no longer facing that world single-handedly was almost too monumental to comprehend. "I need some time," she said finally, "to think about everything, to figure out what I want." "Of course," Aisling agreed immediately. "Take all the time you need." "We're not going anywhere." As the evening drew to a close, Zadie found herself reluctant to leave, despite the emotional intensity of their discussions. There was something unexpectedly comforting about this space, about being with these people who, whether she was ready to acknowledge it fully or not, were her family. When Ashir called a car service to take her back to the hotel, both he and Aisling walked her to the door. No one attempted physical contact, all still carefully respecting the boundaries Zadie had established, but something in their expressions, a mixture of hope, affection, and restraint, touched her deeply. "Thank you for coming tonight," Aisling said. "It meant a lot to us." "Thank you for dinner," Zadie replied, the conventional response feeling inadequate for the significance of the evening, but all she could manage in the moment. As the car pulled away from the curb, Zadie looked back through the window. Ashir and Aisling stood in the doorway of their home, framed by warm light, watching her depart. Not with the relief of obligation fulfilled, but with the patient longing of people who knew they were watching a piece of their heart drive away. For the first time since finding the photograph, Zadie allowed herself to fully consider the possibility that they might truly want her, not out of guilt or obligation, but out of genuine love for the daughter they had lost and found again. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, a door opening to a future she had never dared imagine. The next week passed in a blur of meetings and decisions. After a night of deep reflection at the hotel, Zadie had called Aisling the next morning with her decision. She would accept their offer of legal guardianship, but wanted to maintain some independence by living in a separate apartment, at least initially. "I understand," Aisling had said, her voice gentle with carefully restrained hope. "We want whatever makes you comfortable." Ashir's legal team moved with remarkable efficiency. Within days, paperwork was filed, appointments arranged with judges who seemed mysteriously available on short notice, and a small but elegant apartment secured in a building coincidentally owned by Varela Development, close enough to Ashir and Aisling's home for convenient visits, but separate enough to give Zadie the space she needed. Now, standing in the empty apartment with its gleaming hardwood floors and wall of windows overlooking a small neighborhood park, Zadie felt the strange vertigo of a life transforming too quickly to process. "We didn't want to furnish it without your input," Aisling explained, standing beside her in the bright living room. "And we thought you might want to choose things yourself." Zadie started, then stopped. "I've never had to furnish an entire apartment before." "We can help," Aisling offered. "Or not. Whatever you prefer." Zadie turned in a slow circle, trying to imagine the empty space filled with furniture, with belongings, with the trappings of a settled life. It was simultaneously exciting and overwhelming. "I think I'd like your help," she admitted. "I don't really know where to start." The smile that bloomed on Aisling's face was worth the small surrender of independence. "We can go shopping today if you'd like, or browse online. Whatever feels right to you." They spent the afternoon together, first walking through local shops. Then, when that proved overwhelming, sitting with laptops at a nearby cafe, creating a digital mood board of furniture and decor. Aisling offered suggestions, but deferred to Zadie's preferences, careful not to impose her taste. By evening, they had ordered the essentials: a bed, a sofa, a dining table, and basic kitchen supplies, all scheduled for delivery over the next few days. "It's really happening, isn't it?" Zadie said, as they walked back toward the apartment building. The reality of her new life beginning to solidify. "It is," Aisling confirmed. "How does it feel?" Zadie considered the question. "Strange. Good, but strange. Like I'm watching someone else's life unfold, except it's mine." Aisling nodded, understanding in her eyes. When something changes this dramatically, this quickly, it can feel surreal. Give yourself time to adjust. There's no rush, no timeline you have to follow. As they reached the building entrance, Zadie's phone chimed with a text. It was from Ashir. "Court-approved emergency guardianship petition. Full hearing in 60 days, but you're officially under our legal protection now. Congratulations, Zadie. Welcome to the family, officially." She showed the message to Aisling, whose eyes immediately filled with tears. "Oh," she breathed. "I didn't expect it to happen so quickly. Ashir must have pulled some significant strings." "Is that okay?" Zadie asked, suddenly uncertain. "Him using his influence like that?" "In this case, absolutely," Aisling replied without hesitation. "The system failed you for 15 years, Zadie. If Ashir's connections can help right that wrong more quickly, I have no ethical qualms about it." The straightforward answer reassured Zadie. Both Ashir and Aisling had been remarkably transparent with her. About the past, about their motivations, about the processes now unfolding. It was a refreshing change from the half-truths and manipulations she had grown accustomed to in the system. "Would you like to have dinner with us tonight?" Aisling asked. "To celebrate?" "Ashir mentioned picking up takeout from that Thai place you said you liked." The casual way Aisling referenced Zadie's preferences, remembered from a previous conversation, incorporated into plans without fanfare, struck a chord. It was such a simple thing to be known, to have one's likes and dislikes acknowledged, Yet Zadie had experienced precious little of it in her life. Yes, she decided. I'd like that. Later, seated around the dining table in Ashir and Isling's home, containers of fragrant Thai food between them, the conversation flowed more easily than ever before. The legal milestone, small though it might seem in the grand scheme of their situation, had shifted something in their dynamic, a tentative step from potential family to actual family, from possibility to reality. I've been meaning to ask, Zadie said during a lull in conversation. How did you two meet the second time, I mean? In London, you said. Ashir and Aisling exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. It was at a sustainable development conference, Ashir explained. I was presenting on green building initiatives, and Aisling was there representing her foundation, which was partnering with developers on community housing projects. I recognized him immediately, Aisling continued, even though it had been years, even though he was using his professional name rather than his birth name. There was something about him that I couldn't forget. I, on the other hand, had no idea, Ashir admitted with a self-deprecating smile. I thought she was just another non-profit executive wanting to discuss partnerships. It wasn't until our third meeting that I began to feel there was something familiar about her. When did you realize? Zadie asked, genuinely curious about this part of their story, the reconnection that had occurred while she was lost to them both. After about 2 months of working together, Aisling said. We were having dinner, discussing a project, and he mentioned spending a summer in Dublin during university. The timing matched, and suddenly everything clicked into place. I still didn't remember her specifically, Ashir added. It was a brief summer romance, one of many adventures during my student years. But when she explained who she was, memories started coming back. And then, Zadie prompted. And then we had a lot to talk about, Aisling said with significant understatement. About that summer, about what had happened afterward, about the years in between. But not about me, Zadie noted, her tone neutral rather than accusatory. No, Aisling acknowledged, pain evident in her expression. Not about you. I was ashamed, afraid of losing him again, and I truly believed, had been led to believe, that you were with a permanent family, happy and settled. By the time we married, Ashir added, we had built our relationship on what we thought was complete honesty. I had shared my past, my family background, my ambitions. Aisling had shared her difficult relationship with her grandfather, her passion for helping vulnerable youth. He shook his head slightly. But this one crucial piece remained hidden. I almost told you so many times, Aisling said quietly, looking at Ashir. Especially when we discussed having children of our own, but the longer I waited, the harder it became. Zadie absorbed this, considering the complex web of choices, secrets, and circumstances that had shaped all their lives. And now, she asked, now that everything's out in the open? Now we move forward, Ashir said simply. Together if that's what you want, one day at a time. The answer, straightforward as it was, resonated with Zadie. One day at a time. It was how she had survived on the streets, how she had navigated the foster system, how she had managed when the future seemed too uncertain to contemplate. It was familiar territory, even if the circumstances were now dramatically different. After dinner, as they were clearing the table, Ashir received a phone call that took him into his home office. When he returned, his expression was grimly satisfied. That was my lawyer, he announced. Robert Hargrove was arrested this afternoon. Multiple charges, including child endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy. They're investigating whether there were other children involved in similar arrangements. The news hit Zadie with unexpected force. Her last foster father, the man whose inappropriate behavior had driven her to the streets, the man who had secretly been part of the conspiracy to keep her hidden, was facing consequences. After years of feeling powerless, of believing that people like Hargrove could act with impunity against children like her, justice was finally in motion. Will I have to testify? She asked, her voice steady despite the churning emotions beneath. Eventually, possibly, Ashir acknowledged, but not immediately. Right now, they have enough evidence from the financial records and other documentation to proceed without your testimony. Zadie nodded, relief mixing with a strange sense of disappointment. Part of her wanted to face Hargrove, to look him in the eye as an equal rather than as the vulnerable child she had been, to let him see that she had survived despite his actions. If it comes to that, Aisling said gently, reading her expression, we'll be right there with you. You won't have to face any of it alone. The promise, so simple, yet so profound, brought unexpected tears to Zadie's eyes. She blinked them back, unwilling to break down completely, but the emotion was too powerful to entirely suppress. Thank you, she managed, her voice thick. Aisling looked like she wanted to embrace Zadie, but restrained herself, respecting the boundaries that still existed between them. Instead, she offered a different kind of connection. I was thinking, she said, that if you're interested, we could look into art classes for you, real ones, with proper instruction. Your talent deserves development. The suggestion, coming at this emotional moment, was perfectly timed, a pivot away from the overwhelming past toward a possible future. Something concrete to focus on rather than the swirl of difficult feelings. I'd like that, Zadie said, grateful for Aisling's intuitive understanding of what she needed. Later, as Zadie prepared to return to the hotel for what would likely be her last few nights there, before moving into the apartment, she found herself lingering in the foyer of Ashir and Aisling's home. For the first time since their reunification, she found herself wanting to initiate physical contact, a small gesture of the connection that was slowly forming between them. Would it be okay, she began hesitantly, if I hugged you, both of you? The question clearly caught them by surprise. Aisling's eyes immediately filled with tears, while Ashir's expression shifted to one of carefully contained emotion. Of course, Aisling said softly, if that's what you want. They moved toward her slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might startle and flee. Zadie took a step forward, and then they were embracing, awkwardly at first, then settling into a group hug that felt both strange and oddly familiar, as if her body remembered something her mind could not. It lasted only a moment before Zadie stepped back, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. But something had shifted, a barrier crossed, a connection physically acknowledged that had previously existed only in words and legal documents. Good night, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll see you tomorrow. As the car pulled away from the curb, taking her back to the hotel, Zadie touched the half-moon pendant around her neck. For so long, it had been a mystery, a talisman of unknown origin. Now it was a physical link to the past, to the mother who had broken it in half rather than send her child into the world without some connection to her origins, to the father who hadn't known to look for her but was now moving heaven and earth to make things right. The future stretching before her was still uncertain in many ways, still filled with adjustments and challenges to navigate. But for the first time in her memory, it also contained hope, the possibility of belonging, of safety, of connections that couldn't be broken by the whims of a system or the cruelty of individuals. As Chicago glittered around her in the night, Zadie allowed herself to believe, just a little, that perhaps her story wasn't ending with this unexpected reunion, but truly beginning. 3 months later, Zadie stood before an easel in the sunlit studio of her art class, brush poised over canvas as she considered her next stroke. Around her, other students, most adults, a few teenagers like herself, worked on their own projects, the room quiet except for the occasional murmur of the instructor offering guidance or encouragement. She had settled into a routine that still sometimes felt like someone else's life. Morning classes at the private school where she had enrolled to complete her education, afternoons in art studios or the quiet comfort of her apartment, evenings often spent with Ashir and Aisling, building family bonds one dinner conversation at a time. Her apartment had transformed from an empty space to a personal sanctuary, filled with furniture she had chosen, art supplies that were hers alone, books that reflected her interests rather than whatever discarded volumes she could find at shelters or libraries. The walls displayed her own artwork alongside prints she had selected, a visual representation of her evolving identity. The legal proceedings had progressed as Ashir had predicted. Full guardianship had been granted without complication, her official identity restored. Robert Hargrove was awaiting trial, his wife having turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity. Other officials implicated in Hugh Finnegan's conspiracy were under investigation. Justice was unfolding, methodical and relentless. That's coming along beautifully, Zadie," her instructor commented, pausing behind her to observe the portrait taking shape on her canvas. You have a remarkable eye for emotional nuance." "Thank you," Zadie replied, still finding it strange to receive praise for something that had once been merely a private escape, a way to process emotions she couldn't express in words. The portrait was of Aisling, or rather of both Aisling and herself, their profiles facing each other, the similarities in their features emphasized. The background remained unfinished, but she had already captured the essence of their matching green eyes, windows to a shared history of loss and rediscovery. When class ended, Zadie packed her supplies carefully, savoring the weight of quality materials, the smell of oils and turpentine, the tangible evidence of her new reality. Outside, the April afternoon was mild, spring finally asserting itself after Chicago's brutal winter. She decided to walk home rather than take the bus, enjoying the simple freedom of movement without fear of exposure or hunger. Her phone chimed with a text as she crossed the park near her building. It was from Ashir. "Dinner tonight? Your grandmother arrived from Boston this afternoon. She's eager to meet you, but only if you feel ready." Zadie paused on the path, considering. She had been gradually expanding her circle of connections, meeting Ashir's sister via video call, having coffee with Aisling's colleague from the foundation, slowly allowing herself to be integrated into the wider web of family and social relationships that came with her new identity. Her maternal grandmother, though, Aisling's mother, represented another significant step. Another person who shared her blood, who had been separated from her by circumstances beyond their control, who had opposed Hugh Finnegan's actions but had been powerless to prevent them. "Yes," she texted back. "What time? 7 p.m. No pressure. If you change your mind, we understand." Ashir's constant reassurance of her autonomy, his careful respect for her boundaries, had been a steady theme throughout this transition. Neither he nor Aisling ever pushed, never presumed, always gave her space to retreat if she needed it. Their patience had done more to build her trust than any grand gesture could have. In her apartment, Zadie showered and changed, selecting an outfit that reflected her evolving style. Still practical, but with touches of self-expression that had previously been impossible when clothing came from donation bins or second-hand stores. She wore her hair loose, the dark curls framing her face in a way that emphasized her resemblance to both biological parents. Before leaving, she retrieved the wooden box Aisling had given her months ago, opening it to examine the contents once more. The tiny hat, the hospital bracelet, the lock of baby hair, tangible proofs of her beginning, of a moment when she had been held, loved, known. She had read Aisling's letter many times now, the tear-stained words of a 16-year-old mother forced to give up her child, believing she was ensuring a better life even as her heart broke. One line in particular had resonated with Zadie. "I don't know if I'll ever see you again, but I promise I will never stop loving you, never stop hoping that somehow, someday, we'll find each other." Against all odds, that hope had been fulfilled. Not in the way anyone could have predicted, not without scars and missing years and pain that could never be completely erased, but fulfilled nonetheless. Carefully returning the box to its place on her dresser, Zadie left for dinner, walking the now familiar route to Ashir and Isling's brownstone. The spring evening was pleasant, trees beginning to bud, the harsh edges of winter softening into promise. Aisling opened the door before Zadie could ring the bell, clearly having watched for her arrival. "You came," she said, the simple phrase laden with gratitude, as if each time Zadie chose to engage with them was a gift rather than an obligation. "I said I would," Zadie replied with a small smile, stepping into the foyer. From the living room came voices, Ashir's familiar tones and another, a woman's voice with a hint of Boston accent overlaying what sounded like Irish cadences. Zadie hesitated, a flutter of nerves in her stomach. "She's lovely," Aisling assured her quietly, "and incredibly happy to meet you. But if it's too much, just say the word, and we can reschedule." Zadie shook her head. "I'm ready." They entered the living room together, where Ashir was engaged in conversation with an elegant woman in her 60s. Silver-streaked red hair, styled in a fashionable bob, her posture impeccable, her hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke. She looked up as they entered, and Zadie saw yet another pair of green eyes, the third generation of the same distinctive trait. The woman stood immediately, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture so similar to Aisling's that it was startling. "Zadie," she said, her voice warm with emotion. "Oh my goodness. You're even more beautiful in person. Zadie, this is my mother, Margaret Donnelly," Aisling introduced formally. "Mom, this is Zadie." Margaret stepped forward, her movements careful, clearly mindful of boundaries. "May I?" she asked, arms slightly raised in question. Zadie nodded, and her grandmother embraced her gently, the scent of a subtle floral perfume enveloping them both. When she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "I've waited so long to meet you," Margaret said, "and I never stopped hoping this day would come." "It's nice to meet you," Zadie replied, the conventional phrase inadequate, but all she could manage in the moment. Dinner was less awkward than Zadie had feared. Margaret was a natural conversationalist, sharing stories of Aisling's childhood, of her own life in Boston, where she taught literature at a university, of family history that filled in pieces of Zadie's heritage she had never known. "Your great-grandmother, my mother, was an artist too," Margaret mentioned when the conversation turned to Zadie's art classes. "Watercolors, primarily. I have several of her paintings hanging in my home. You must come visit sometime. I think you'd appreciate her work." "I'd like that," Zadie found herself saying, surprised by her own readiness to consider expanding her connections beyond Chicago. As the evening progressed, Zadie observed the interactions between Aisling and her mother, the easy affection, the inside jokes, the occasional gentle teasing. This was what a mother-daughter relationship could look like, what it should look like. It was both fascinating and quietly painful to witness, a glimpse of what she had missed, but also what might be possible in a different form as her relationship with Aisling continued to evolve. After dessert, as they lingered over tea in the living room, Margaret reached into her handbag and withdrew a small box. "I brought something for you," she said, offering it to Zadie. "If you'd rather not accept gifts yet, I completely understand. But this seemed appropriate." Zadie took the box, opening it carefully. Inside lay a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a crescent moon that perfectly matched the pendant she wore around her neck. "And it completes the set," Margaret explained. "The necklace was split into 2 pieces, one for Aisling, one for you. The bracelet was meant to be given when you turned 16. She smiled softly. "I'm a few months late, but better late than never, I hope." Zadie lifted the bracelet from the box, the silver catching the light. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift, the way it acknowledged both what was lost and what might be reclaimed. "May I?" Aisling asked, gesturing toward the bracelet. Zadie extended her wrist, allowing Aisling to fasten the delicate chain. The 3 women looked at it together, grandmother, mother, daughter, a tangible symbol of connection across generations, across time, across the gaps that had separated them. perfect fit, Margaret observed, satisfaction in her voice. Later, as the evening drew to a close, Zadie found herself on the back patio with Ashir, while Aisling and Margaret cleared dessert plates inside. The spring night was cool but pleasant, stars visible despite the city lights, a crescent moon, a real one, hanging in the dark sky. Doing okay?" Ashir asked quietly, his perceptiveness once again detecting the subtle signals of her emotional state. "It's been a big day." "I'm good," Zadie replied, and was somewhat surprised to realize it was true. "It's a lot, but good." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the night sky. Zadie appreciated that about Ashir, his comfort with silence, his lack of need to fill every moment with words or questions or reassurances. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said finally. "About my name. What about it?" Ashir turned slightly to face her, his expression open and attentive. "Zadie," she elaborated. Was it the name you and Aisling chose for me? Originally?" Ashir's expression softened with understanding. "No," he said gently. "Since I didn't know about you, I wasn't part of naming you. Aisling named you Zara, after my grandmother." "Zara," Zadie repeated, testing the sound of it. Not that different from Zadie. "No," Ashir agreed. Which makes me wonder if perhaps somewhere in your subconscious you remembered. When you chose a name for yourself on the streets, perhaps some part of you remembered who you really were." The thought was oddly comforting. The idea that even when everything else had been taken from her, some essential part of her identity had remained, had guided her back toward herself. "Do you prefer Zara?" Ashir asked, nothing but curiosity in his tone. "Because if you do, we can certainly use that name going forward." Zadie considered this, the possibility of reclaiming her birth name, of realigning completely with the identity that had been stolen from her. But after a moment, she shook her head. "I think I'm Zadie now," she decided. "Zara was the baby you lost. Zadie is who I became, who I am." Ashir nodded, respect in his expression. "Zadie it is then." The back door slid open, and Aisling joined them on the patio. "Everything okay out here?" "We're just admiring the night," Ashir replied, making room for her to join them at the railing. The three of them stood together, a newly formed family still finding its way, still navigating the complexities of their unusual bond. Zadie was acutely aware of the empty years between them, the experiences they hadn't shared, the memories they would never have. But she was also increasingly aware of the present moment, of the future stretching before them. A future in which they would create new memories, forge new bonds, build something that, while different from the typical family experience, could be meaningful and genuine nonetheless. "I was thinking," Zadie said after a moment, "about the holidays." "Oh," Aisling prompted gently. "I've never really celebrated them." "Not properly," Zadie explained. "And I was wondering if maybe this year we could. Together." The simple suggestion, a commitment to a future family event, a willingness to plan for shared experiences, was significant in its normalcy. Ashir and Aisling exchanged a quick glance, joy evident in their expressions, though they tried to keep their reactions measured. "We'd love that," Aisling said simply. Maybe we could even travel," Ashir suggested. "To Boston to see your grandmother, or perhaps to Istanbul to meet my family. If you're comfortable with that idea, of course." The thought of travel, of expanding her world beyond Chicago, of meeting extended family, of being introduced as their daughter, was both exhilarating and intimidating. But Zadie found herself nodding, ready to consider possibilities that would have seemed impossible just months before. "I'd like that," she said. "Not right away, but eventually." "No rush," Ashir assured her. "We have time." Time. Such a simple concept, yet so profound in this context. Time to heal, to build trust, to create connections. Time that had been stolen from them, but was now being reclaimed, day by day, moment by moment. As they stood together under the crescent moon, Zadie felt a sense of peace settling over her. Not complete, not perfect, but genuine. The pendant around her neck, the bracelet on her wrist, the physical presence of a sheer and Aisling beside her, all tangible reminders that she was no longer alone, no longer lost, no longer just surviving. She was, at long last, beginning to live. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.